Do you know the tally of last year's presidential vote in favor of Xi Jinping by the National People's Congress? What was the vote? Can you tell our audience here?
I think it's up to about 100%. That doesn't.
2,952 to 0.
Yes, that's exactly what I said.
Could you not find a few people just to make it look a little even? One or two?
Mehdi, it's
Five?
not surprising. It's not surprising.
2,952 to 0.
您现在看到的画面是不久前半岛电视台英语频道播出的一期节目啊，大家可以看到啊，唇枪舌剑，煞是好看啊。
One person out of 3,000 couldn't say, Xi Jinping, not my guy. One.
What if he is the guy for all the Communist Party of China? You
What
never
if?
know.
Well,
never know.
if that's the case, then your entire first answer is redundant because it doesn't matter if there's 100 million people. They all have to follow the leader.
No, he does command huge respect among the Chinese people as well as
You
in
say
the ruling
respect, I
party.
say fear.
这期节目播出之后啊，在网上引起了巨大的反响，尤其是在中国境内和境外呢，产生了完全不同的评价。在中国境内呢，很多人都给这个嘉宾点赞，说这个嘉宾呢舌战西方的媒体记者啊，维护了中国的国家利益啊，点赞，了不起，民族英雄。但是呢，在防火墙之外啊，很多人都说这个嘉宾你看到吗，是个大外宣，面对记者啊的提问呢，他被驳得体无完肤啊。然后呢，狼狈不堪呢，可见大外宣的逻辑啊，实际上是没有办法自洽，导致了狼狈的这样的一种状态啊。一期节目啊，在中国境内和中国境外形成了如此啊冰火两重天的这样的一种怎么评价哈，我觉得挺有意思的。所以这两天呢，我仔细看了一下这个47分钟的访问啊，我觉得这期节目值得说的啊。在说这期节目之前呢，我们首先介绍一下这期节目的背景啊。这期节目的主持人名叫哈桑，这哈桑啊是个英国人啊，前几年加入了美国的国籍，所以他是一个英裔美国人，据说是牛津大学基督教学院毕业的啊，高材生啊。然后呢，他毕业之后基本就是在媒体圈子里工作。在2020年的时候呢，他从幕后走到了前台，主持了一档节目，叫做《政治秀》。大家都知道啊，在欧美这些国家里头啊，如果你在电视台做前台工作，尤其是做近乎于脱口秀的这种采访啊，要求你这个人反应特别快，提问本身还必须具有十足的挑衅性啊。这哈桑呢，坐到这个位置的，说句实话，还是挺了不起的啊。我也问了一些美国的朋友啊，就哈桑啊，在美国和在英国呢，知名度还是挺高的，算是一个比较有名的主持人。那么今年啊，这个半岛电视台的英语频道就宣布他们的王牌节目叫《面对面》啊，重新开始新的一期节目录制。那么他就把这个哈桑请到这里做主持人。那么在哈桑请了今年这个7月份录制的过程中，就开始遍请国际上的嘉宾嘛，于是就请来了本期节目的嘉宾高志凯。
Victor Gao, thank you so much for joining me on Head to Head this evening here in London.
Thank you for having me.
这高志凯是什么来头呢？我看国外的媒体都介绍说，他早年呢是邓小平的翻译啊。我查了一下他的履历啊，这高志凯呢是1962年出生，是江苏太仓人。他呢上高一的时候正搞上这个改革开放之后呢恢复高考。他呢虽然没有高中毕业，就参加了高考，没想到呢一下还考上了大学，就学起了英文。在他英文系毕业之后呢，当时北外要招收联合国这个英语的口译的培训员，他呢就报考了这个班。这个班呢学制是2年啊，当时要学这个同声传译啊什么之类的啊。所以他当时上这个班的时候呢，就立志想要到联合国去工作，但没想到毕业之后呢，把他分配到了外交部，在外交部里头做口语翻译工作。由于当年就是这个外交部高级口语人才比较少，所以年纪轻轻的这个高志凯呢，就坐上了邓小平的这个口语翻译。据他自己讲他为什么能当上邓小平的口语翻译呢？一个是他是嗓音比较好，还有他个子也不是特别高，在这个领导人旁边呢，好像也不是特别有存在感啊。然后翻译的功底当然也是不错的，于是就给邓小平陆陆续续做了20几场翻译啊。那么到了1988年的时候他呢如愿以偿到联合国去工作了工作了不到1年，他就转向了。他在基辛格的推荐之下呢，就到了耶鲁大学去攻读法学博士学位。后来这个耶鲁大学毕业之后呢，就在美国的律所里做律师，做了2年之后呢，又回到了香港做一些咨询公司的这个工作啊。然后再不久呢，又回到了国内， 据他自己讲啊，在一些国企里还做过高管，然后呢，也在国际上的一些大型的咨询公司，在中华区的一些负责人呢。同时呢，他就加入了这个民主党派，他是民革北京市的这个党员啊。我看在民革的文章里还介绍他，说呢，他这些年呢，他经常是给这个共产党的一些高层搞建言建策。比较有名的呢是08年的时候北京要召开奥运会，他提出了一个理论。因为当时要搞奥运会的时候，很多不是西方国家要找中国的别扭吗？他就提出了一个理论，叫做鱼钩和长矛的理论。什么意思呢？他就说面对中国搞奥运会要开放的姿态，接受外国的很多东西进来那么有一类就西方跟中国的这种挑衅呢，他说就是鱼钩。那么鱼钩实际上他是想让你咬，你咬完了之后，你越急越赠，他是看你笑话他说还有一类呢是长矛。就是说，它不是鱼钩，就是过来对你直接进行进攻的。他说，中国面对西方这个媒体对中国的这些报道或者说西方这个社会对中国的这些攻击要分清楚这两种不同的形态。对鱼钩呢，中国要采取耐心的策略，不咬钩。你不咬钩，它实际上就没效果了嘛。但是对长矛，那叫坚决回击，要把这两种东西分清楚。据说他当年写的这个策略报告还受到了胡锦涛的亲自批示而且被采纳了所以他呢后来也是统战部据说是这个一个什么信息员经常给国内的高层写一些内参报告。那么后来呢，我看了一下，他也是什么欧美同学会的一些理事当然我最近又查了一下，欧美同学会的理事最新的一届他已经不在了但是不管怎么说他的身份给人感觉他好像是中国所谓的民间外交的这么一个舞台的这个一员。所谓民间外交就是说这些人不是中共的这个正式官员，也不是赵立坚，是不是？也不是这个中华人民共和国的这些干部但是呢，利用一些民间舞台来宣传中国。所以他的外交理念也包括他在国际场合上以各种各样评论员身份来接受采访的时候他代表的就是中国政府的观点。所以他其实能够接受西方媒体记者的采访本身也有看头。那么正因为如此我猜可能半岛电视台请他来做这期节目的嘉宾那在这里头，我还再介绍一下这个面对面这个节目。应该说，这个面对面的节目不是一个正儿八经的采访类的节目，它是一个秀。那么所谓的秀跟采访之间最大的区别是什么呢？那就是采访的节目，我们一般来讲我们还是尽可能的让一个嘉宾来完整表述他的这个观点，阐述他的看法。然后呢，作为一个新闻媒体的记者呢，尽可能的在他的完整阐述过程中间寻找他的一些逻辑漏洞，来跟他探讨，作为一些观点的碰撞。但是秀我们去看秀的时候秀其实并不要求你这个嘉宾在这里头完整阐述观点，他追求的是一个高强度的戏剧化的冲突，就是要好看节奏要快。所以你看到了吗？哈桑秀这期节目里头，这主持人的提问是非常非常快的，语速是非常非常快的。你要是正儿八经的一个那个采访类的节目，你这么快的话，这像打仗，对不对？像辩论，它并不像是一个交流。所以对于一个秀的节目来讲它其实更强调的是戏剧化的冲突。所以对于这样的节目来说，主持人事先准备的这些问题都是挖坑式的，就是看你嘉宾面对这种陷阱性的提问的过程中间，你到底有没有可能掉进去，一掉进去就好看了当然我并不知道高志凯为什么接受这个媒体的这个邀请采访但应该他可以想象得到那么他要参加这样一个秀的节目是需要非常强的现场临机反应能力的。那么紧接着这期节目这个是在今年7月份录制的在今年8月份播出的。那我们就来看一看高志凯接受哈桑采访过程中间传递出来的一些问题该怎么解读在整个这个采访过程中间，大致分为4个方面。上来呢，哈桑首先就讲的关于台湾问题。
China is getting ready to invade Taiwan, isn't it?
There is only one China. Taiwan is part of China, and the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government for the totality of China. The exact status between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait is the unfinished civil war back in 1949. So ever since the beginning of the 1980s, China does not want to use a war to solve this unification problem.
You don't want to use a war, but you're surrounding it with ships, drones, cyber attacks, and making lots of threats.
Each time when the separatists in Taiwan want to push the edge of the envelope, they will come across more and more demonstration of the commitment of the Chinese nation to eventually achieve peaceful reunification or otherwise.
Your defense minister said anyone who dares to pursue independence for Taiwan will be crushed into pieces and face destruction. Sounds like a truly peaceful guy.
That's a real statement, because
I know
if the separatists really want to push the edge of the envelope with the aid of some big country, for example, which wants to use Taiwan as a proxy in its own geopolitical rivalry against China, then wait until you see what will happen.
And why this obsession with Taiwan? You are a country of 3.7 million square miles, a population 60 times that of Taiwan, economy 20 times the size of Taiwan. Why are you obsessed with Taiwan? Why not just leave them be?
In terms of defending China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, any inch of land is not 1 inch too much. Any one single person is not one person too many. So we need to achieve reunification.
Even though they don't want to be part of your country. 12% of the people of Taiwan say they want to reunify with China. 12%. You can't get more unpopular than that in that.
Mehdi, it's not up to the people in Taiwan to decide about the One China policy.
You're very blunt in your disregard for people's views, freedoms, dignity. You say you don't care about what they think.
我个人觉得啊，哈桑关于这个台湾问题啊，跟这个高志凯的这个唇枪舌剑，应该说没有占到太大的便宜，因为高志凯啊，他反复就在讲，是吧？按照中国的法理来讲，台湾就属于中国的一部分，然后因为是一个内战的延续嘛，而且呢，即便是你台湾人不愿意，那么这个台湾的去留，它不取决于台湾本身，应该说它这一套的理论呢，在国际法上基本上是站得住脚的，所以就是说，关于这第一回合。实际上，高志凯应该说也是有备而来。所以，为什么高志凯啊，在这个整个这个节目结束之后，他把这前面这9分钟啊，关于台湾问题这部分单独剪出来，放到了新浪微博上。他也是认为，在这个回合上，他没有落下风，基本上没有落下风。当然了啊，就我看了这个片段之后，我觉得高志凯也犯了一些错误。
You also said in an interview with the French newspaper Le Monde, once we get the island back, we'll have to ask everyone's origins. Those who have Japanese ancestry, who you basically say can constitute 10% of the population, will have to pledge loyalty to reunification in writing, otherwise we'll have to help them leave. You're basically calling for the ethnic cleansing of 2.3 million people in Taiwan.
No, you remember back in 1945, when Japan unconditionally surrendered, a lot of people in Taiwan who originally came from Japan, they were the rulers of Taiwan at the time, they stayed behind because of the magnanimity of the Chinese nation. Now, several decades later, they account for about 10% of the local population in Taiwan. Now, if you really do your homework, you will realize that those die-hard Taiwanese separatists include many of these Japanese
completely baseless
Chinese.
Claims, but okay.
Well,
but you would get rid of them. You would get rid of 2.3 million people.
No, after the reunification, everyone in Taiwan need to make a pledge whether they acknowledge there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China.
And if they don't make that pledge, they're out.
Those who pledge for the one China policy, they are local.
You didn't, by the way,
citizens.
You didn't say everyone. You said of Japanese descent. That is literally ethnic. You're picking people by their ethnic heritage, making them do a loyalty test. Otherwise, they have to get out of the country they've
lived
in.
It is not a loyalty test.
那我特地查了一下啊，那么中华民国收回台湾之后呢，其实是要求当时驻扎在台湾的这些日本人呢，通通都走掉。那么日本政府也有统计数据，那么整个从台湾回到日本的这个日本人呢，一共是47万。这47万里头呢，大概有31万是平民，剩下的是军人啊。但是中华民国政府呢，也有一些统计啊，就当时有很多日本人在台湾其实已经生活了好几十年。他们不愿意离开台湾，所以他们当时就申请在台湾永居。虽然是日本人啊，当时中华民国政府呢就同意了啊，所以很多日本人就留在了台湾。但是事隔之后不久，尤其是228之后，这国民党政府就把这个当时的日本人基本全部又赶回到了日本去了。所以台湾真正留下来的日本人的数量是非常少的。说他们这批人呢，说繁衍生息，最终变成了10%的台湾人，我觉得这个数据不靠谱，这是其一。第二，更重要的是台湾今天主张台独的人，你要说是日裔日本人那我觉得这个数据更不靠谱。 大家可以看一下，台湾民进党啊，台湾现在那个更激进的激进党啊，他们那些人多数啊都是台湾本土的，也就是说，往上述几代都是来自于大陆，是吧？你看台湾现在头面的那些人物啊，那其实他们多数都有非常清晰的血统，能够证明他们其实祖先就是来自于中国大陆，而不是来自于日本啊。所以其实啊，高志凯在这第一回合过程中间引述的这些数据本身是错的，我也不知道他这个数据是哪来的啊。这是关于第一回合啊，我觉得第一回合甚至可以说高志凯还是略微占了一点点上风。那么第二回合紧接着讨论的就是中国的人权问题。那么在人权问题上呢，这个哈桑啊，那他用的这个例子是什么呢？就是关于维吾尔的问题。
You've called Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province your brothers and sisters. How do you feel about the fact that at least 500,000, some say more, of your brothers and sisters are being detained in camps by the Chinese government? That's 5% of the adult Uyghur population, one of the highest imprisonment detention rates in the world.
Mehdi, the Uyghurs are a proud ethnic group, one of the 56 ethnic nationalities in China. The Uyghurs, as far as I'm concerned, are my true brothers and sisters. I know many of them. I travel to Xinjiang regularly, and I talk to many of the Uyghurs. Now, if anyone is serious about accusing China of practicing mass injustice to the Uyghurs, give me the evidence. I
Just
think
did. Human Rights Watch say 500,000 people detained over the years in recent years.
you keep quote Human Rights Watch, and I tell you.
Do you know where they got those numbers from?
I don't know.
Can I tell
don't
you?
know. I don't know.
I thought you were the expert on
I
You've
do
been to
not know.
Xinjiang, you've spoken to Uyghurs. You never heard these numbers?
I do not know where did they get the source.
So
of
their
the
source is the
quotation.
Xinjiang High People's Procuratorate, which has published its own statistics, Xinjiang official body, which says it's convicted 540,826 people prosecuted in the region since 2017. The United Nations Office for Human Rights looked at satellite footage. They say 10 to 20% of the population. Amnesty estimates 1 million people in camps. 500,000 is a conservative number.
Mehdi, if you quote that organization, please be assured that that organization has been completely discredited for the false information they came up with.
I love this game we're playing. You give me a source, I give you a source. They're discredited. They've said falsehoods.
Mehdi,
How can we? Let me ask you a question. How many people are in detention in Xinjiang? You give me a number.
Listen, if you look
I'm
at
listening.
Xinjiang,
You give me a number.
If you look at, I do not have the number.
Why not?
Yeah.
Hold on. You can't say it's not 500,000 and then say you don't have a number. I have a number. I have sources. How many people do you think are detained?
Let me give you my reason.
No.
I go to Xinjiang a lot. I travel
So
almost
they're your brothers and
throughout
sisters.
Xinjiang.
You go there a lot, but you
Yes.
can't tell me how many people are in detention.
Listen, they are happier. They enjoy their life. They enjoy their Muslim practices and traditions. Listen,
How many people are in detention, Victor?
Mehdi, let me be philosophical.
No, don't be philosophical. Be
If any-
numerical.
No.
How many people are in detention? You said no to 500,000. How about, okay, let's
Let-
let 250,000.
Let me finish my point.
Nope.
If
You answer the
anyone-
question. You
if-
can't filibuster, Victor, on this
If
show.
anyone
How many
promotes
people do you
Xinjiang
think?
independence, they will be dealt with in
Got it.
law.
我个人觉得，那么在整个这个论辩过程中间，高志凯试图就把所有新疆的问题都归结为统独问题，就是说新疆这些人之所以受到了处理，那么就是因为他们不愿意接受新疆是中国一部分这样的一个框架。但很快现场人就开始批判了。
Yeah, my brother Akbar Assad is a prominent tech entrepreneur. In fact, your own media outlet called him a bright star in the tech world. Right before his detention, he was invited on a state gala dinner, and then he disappeared. How could you explain that?
Mehdi, again, in China, we have about 20 Muslim ethnic groups. You need to ask one question. Why the extremism existed mostly among the Uyghur communities? Because there are extremists among the Uyghur community who want to separate Xinjiang away from
Has your
China.
brother been convicted of any crime?
Supported by CIA and other Western
the
organizations.
CIA. Okay. Rehan,
That's the real truth.
Hold on.
Talk to the Kazakhs, they don't support.
has your brother been
Xinjiang
convicted of a crime?
According to UN, there's no trial has taken place. He just forcibly disappeared. Actually, it amounts to enforced disappearance. But according to the Chinese government, he committed a crime of inciting ethnic discrimination while he's systematically oppressed. And when I challenged that decision, because under the Chinese law, if you're committed with the alleged crime, that you have 3 years sentence, but he got 15 years. How do you justify that?
我个人觉得， 其实高志凯没有办法解释新疆问题，为什么呢？因为新疆问题啊，我们知道啊，中共它其实在新疆实行的政策，它跟一个这个法治化的国家不一样。法治化的国家是你有了问题，比如说你犯罪了，我开始事后进行惩罚。但是在新疆呢，中国实行的是这样一套制度，它是采取了一种预防性的制度，预防性的措施，就是为了保证新疆没有暴恐事件，那我就把所有的维吾尔族人基本上都采取了一种区别对待的政策。那么你看，你只要稍微不顺眼，我就把你送到学习营里头去了。那么只要稍微有人举报你一下，然后你就失去自由了，就失踪了。这中间也没有经过任何一个司法程序嘛。那么这种所谓的预防性措施，确确实实让新疆今天啊，基本上没有什么样的一个暴恐袭击了。但是它的代价是什么呢？它的代价就是维吾尔人的基本权利。你只要是一个维吾尔族人，你不能申请护照，然后你离开新疆，你就寸步难行。你到北京，你连这样的一个酒店旅馆你也住不下啊，甚至你突然失踪之后，跟家人之间也没有联系。那么这些是不是违反人权呢？是不是侵犯人权呢？显然是啊。但是呢，高志凯他没有办法面对这一切，所以他就只能把它归结为说是这个是一个所谓的不愿意承认新疆是中国一部分的问题。
The real crime involved by some of the Uyghur people are agitating for Xinjiang independence. They violate the One China policy. I hope.
But our brother's been detained for 8 years.
Well, I do
8
not know the
years.
charge. I hope I can help you to really look at the case, at the accusation against him.
Yeah,
I
one
hope
last
your
comment.
brother is not guilty of inciting for separatism of Xinjiang. If that is the case, then let the law take its course.
Well, your media outlet called him a model citizen who is a promoter of ethnic unity in Xinjiang.
Have you been able to speak to your brother or see
No,
him?
not at all. Like, for 8 years, he's forcibly disappeared. Up until last month, for the first time, my parents saw him. What kind of justice system is that? You're making a mockery
You're not
of the
just
rule of
detaining
law.
them.
And I hope you will tell your brother, be a staunch supporter of One China policy, be a proud
I cannot
Chinese
tell him he's
Uyghur,
in prison.
rather
She
than
can't tell him because she can't speak to him because you
Xinjiang
deny
away
access,
from
Victor.
China.
Victor, she can't speak to him. Are you going to arrange it? Are you going to arrange a visit now?
I'll be happy to help you to
Oh,
make
wow.
a phone call.
There's a lot of promises being made here, guys. You should
You are
follow
all
up on this
witnesses.
afterwards.
You are all witnesses.
We are witnesses indeed.
那这呢，他就显然是狡辩了啊。这是第二个方面，就是关于人权问题。第三个方面呢，就比较精彩了啊，也是整个这个访谈过程中最精彩的部分呢，就是关于言论自由的问题。
So I'll ask again tonight. Is he now president for life, a true dictator?
For the record, first of all, Chinese President Xi Jinping will never be president for life. There will be a time limit. When it will be handled according to the Chinese legal system and constitution. Secondly, there is no dictator in China. Why? Because dictatorship simply doesn't work. Democracy means modernization. And how can you explain profound transformation of China over the past 45 years in China if you have dictatorship or authoritarian rule? No, every leader in China will be put into a team, and teamwork will be much more important
Xi Jinping's
than
run
individualism.
teams, Victor. Do you know how many names were on the ballot papers that were given in 2013? How many names were on the ballot paper when they went to choose the president? Can you tell our audience?
I think there is only one candidate.
Yeah, there were no other names. That's a real secure leader, a guy who knows he has the confidence of his people. You get to vote, but only for me, and none of you can actually vote against me.
Mehdi, we do not want to end up in a situation with 6 prime ministers in 80 years.
Yeah. So you prefer a dictatorship?
No, we prefer a system that works for the benefit of the Chinese people.
I've not said a word about what works or not. You got great economic growth.
Look at the
But you're a
economic
dictatorship.
There is no dictatorship, Mehdi.
You just
you
admitted
want me to,
that there's no name
repeat?
on the ballot paper, no votes against him, and they all just follow him. Your answer is, it's a dictatorship that works. At least say that.
No.
No, you can't. You keep dodging. One minute you say,
I'm not
it's not a
dodging.
dictatorship. Then I show you it is. You say, but it's working. We've got growth.
那实际上这个论述是有问题的，因为你的假设是独裁是不可能带来经济发展，但实际上独裁跟经济发展之间实际上并不是完全相悖的，独裁同样可以带来经济发展嘛。所以他在用一个错误的假设性的前提推导出来的一个结论本身是存在问题的。那哈桑就紧追不舍问他呀
Here you have Rishi Sunak, the former prime minister, was called a pint-sized loser by a Labour politician. No one in China has that kind of freedom to talk about their government, to talk about President Xi Jinping in that way. You can't say anything like that. You wouldn't dare say anything like that because you know what will happen to you when you go home. You know what will happen to your family. That's what China is.
Mehdi, if you do anything, write anything, email or chat to your friends about taking anything action against, let's say, Prime Minister of Britain,
That's not what I
President
said.
of the United States,
I didn't say that.
you'll be dealt with
That's not
very
what I said.
swiftly.
Victor, you're a master of
In
straw man.
China- in
That's not
China-
what I said.
in-
I said Rishi Sunak was called a pint-sized loser. Would you call Xi Jinping a pint-sized loser?
Mehdi, each country has different sensitivities. In UK,
So you're admitting you can't criticize the Chinese government?
No. You can criticize the government if you are positive in your attitude.
You can criticize the government if you're positive.
Yes.
Is that the new philosophy?
No, if you can come up with your
You've got to come up with
constructive-
nice insults.
No.
What then?
Constructive advice.
Constructive advice.
For example,
Oh, I'm loving
in
this.
dealing with the aging population, what should be the government do? What should this governor should do?
But you
What
can't
should
say
they-
the president's lied. He's a liar.
No, you will be dealt with very swiftly in China. You cannot say that.
That is the most honest thing you've said tonight.
那么这个段落过程中，有一个香港的女孩就站起来提问，我觉得香港的女孩啊，是这个访谈过程中间非常亮眼的一个人啊，她显然也是有备而来。我估计她可能是香港反送中之后啊，又移民到英国的一个香港人，她就问
My question is, as a dissident from Hong Kong, knowing that I cannot express freely in Hong Kong or in the UK without risking other people in trouble, I also know that you just now made claims about there's free speech in China, and it's possible to criticize the Chinese government just now again. Can you please demonstrate that free speech and tell us what are Xi Jinping's two worst mistakes in the past 5 years?
Great question.
If you can demonstrate to us that it's okay to criticize Xi Jinping, the Chinese government, and China, or even just say Xi Jinping kind of resembles Winnie the Pooh, would be good enough for me. Thank you.
结果这个高志凯啊，当时现场就断片了。为什么断片了呢？他不敢回答这个问题，但他也不知道怎么面对这个问题，于是他就开始王顾左右而言他。
Well, thank you. I would say China need to make more prompt, take more prompt actions in dealing with the dramatic aging population in China and the dramatic demographic decline.
Do you think Xi Jinping's to blame for not being fast enough on aging?
No, I think the whole Chinese government, including
not
the
Xi
Central Committee, State Council, local government, need to take actions quickly to reverse that dramatic aging population problem and demographic
We're
decline.
not going to get a criticism out of you.
其实这实际上就说出了中国言论问题的本质。什么本质？因为言论自由本质上来讲就是批评的权利嘛，批评那个统治者的权利嘛。但显而易见，在中国谁也不敢批评习近平，谁也不敢轻易评价习近平，更不用说嘲讽习近平了。那高志凯自己心里跟明镜一样，他完全清楚这一点。但是呢，他面对这个当时的英国的电视观众，他不敢承认这一点。但是人家问题又提出来怎么办呢？这小姑娘就提出来这个问题，你说说习近平到底犯什么错误了？他敢讲吗？他不敢讲。这是所有专制制度在逻辑上最后的一个 bug。你再说你有言论自由，你不敢批评习近平，那不就等于没有言论自由吗？甚至他其实都不敢承认自己不敢评论习近平。那这此前所有的那种论述，那其实不都是假的吗？是吧？所以我觉得这是非常精彩的一个段落啊。紧接着第4个段落就是涉及到中国的法治问题。这哈桑呢就举了一个秦刚的例子。
Former Foreign Minister Qin Gang was removed from his post and has not been seen in public since June 2023. A few months later, China's Defense Minister General Li Shangfu disappeared from public view for months, has now been expelled from the party, accused of corruption. That's at least 2 ministers that disappeared just in the last year.
This means China is really merciless in dealing with corruption of all kinds, even among the
Your
highest
foreign
ranks.
minister and defense minister. Imagine Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin just disappeared tomorrow. We don't know where they are. We've never seen them again. That's not normal, Victor.
Listen, corruption is rampant
How
in
do we know
China.
they're corrupt? They just disappeared. Where's the trial?
Allow
Where's the
me
trial,
to
Victor?
finish my point. Corruption of all kinds
Yeah.
in China need to be dealt with.
So where's
with
the trial?
Mercilessness.
So where's the trial? Where's the trial of the former foreign minister? We don't even know where he is.
Mehdi, those things you don't know doesn't mean doesn't happen.
Where is the trial for this man you're just accusing of corruption?
Qin Gang was my good friend for more than 20 years.
Where is he then?
He is involved in corruption.
Where is he?
And he is dealt with very swiftly.
Where is he, Victor?
Regardless of
He's your
the
good friend. You don't know where he is.
Regardless
Where
of
is
the
the former
seniority
foreign minister
his
of China?
position.
This is not a hard question. We're not asking where Rehan's brother in the middle of Xinjiang is that you can dodge. Where is the former foreign minister of China who disappeared? And by the way, he wasn't accused of corruption. The spokesman came out and said he has health reasons. Then corruption came later, by the way. Where did he go, your friend?
That means there is a process. And the process
The process
is
starts
not
with
ju-
one lie that he's ill, and then the next lie is he's corrupt.
He may be ill. You never know.
I mean, he's probably ill after he's been in a Chinese prison.
He may be ill now.
Yeah,
You never know. But,
exactly.
But at least
Where is
Qin
he?
Gang lost his job
Victor, where is
because
he?
of his corruption.
Last question.
That's the point.
Where is he?
He's somewhere in China. You will never see him.
但是这里头啊，最关键的不是说秦刚和李尚福是不是腐败，哈桑的意思就是说你程序是不是正当，你这秦刚到底去哪儿了呀？人在哪儿啊？你不是跟他20多年是朋友吗？他这个人到底跑哪儿去了？他有没有被讯问呢？他有没有自己辩护的权利啊？那说句心里话，那这个高志凯实际上是没办法回答这个问题的。
And no, it's not just him. There's many other people who've disappeared. The previous defense minister disappeared. The Ministry of Industry and Technology disappeared. The former Interpol president disappeared. In China, you just disappear if they don't like you. That's the rule of law in China.
I'm so
in fact,
happy they disappear because if they keep doing their job, they will bring greater disaster.
这实际上是两个问题。人家问你的是一个正当程序，你不是说你中国是个法治国家吗？你法治国家，你要行使正义的话，必须有一套正当程序做保障。但是呢，你在反复的讲他是不是有罪，他是不是有问题，这完全是这两回事儿。
Victor, be careful what you wish for, because everyone's watching this show, and if you get something wrong tonight, maybe you disappear.
If I disappear, I hope you will bail me out.
I'd have to find you first, and China's apparently a big country.
就整个这个访谈呢，大致是这4个方面啊。如果我要是给双方打比分的话，那我觉得呢，差不多是3比1。也就是说，第一个关于台湾问题，高志凯在整个辩论过程中间没有落下风，但是后面涉及到中国的人权问题、言论自由问题和法治问题，那高志凯确确实实是被驳得体无完肤啊。那么呢，最后我还想说几点啊。首先第一点，我觉得啊，高志凯参与这个节目啊。这个总体来讲还是保持了一个基本的风度，他这个面对这个态度还算是比较沉稳啊。虽然他有的时候在逻辑上没有办法自圆其说的情况下，他还是能够保持一个基本的风度，那我觉得非常了不起。尤其是作为一个中国的这样的一个，你说是评论员也好，这个公共外交、民间外交的这样的一个人物也好啊，那在中国的政府官员中间啊。是不太有人敢轻易接受媒体记者采访的，尤其是这种怎么说挑衅式的西方媒体记者的采访，因为你要是你稍微要是反应不好，你有可能变得非常狼狈嘛。但是在整个这个过程中间，我觉得高志凯啊，这风度还是在的，而且基本上啊，他态度上还算是比较平和，没有那么强的攻击性。
China's security rests on the principle that there is only one China. And Taiwan is part of China, Tibet is part of China, and Xinjiang is part of China, period.
And even if the people there don't want to be part of it, you don't give a damn.
The majority of the people live happily as
How do we
Chinese
know?
citizens.
Did you do a vote?
I will go with you to
We're
Tibet.
going to go to Tibet and we're going to talk to all the Tibetans.
And possibly
I
also
can go to Tibet,
Taiwan.
but the guy who's from there can't go there. You sound ludicrous.
那么这一点呢，我们把它当作是整个中国政府的一个形象的一部分中间，那我觉得确确实实还是不多见的。可能啊，跟他常年做英语翻译啊，较多的接受了英语文化这一点有关啊。第二点，这高志凯啊，我也查了一下，他本身呢不算是中国政府的这个成员啊，了不起也就算是民间外交的这么一个代言人啊，但是他实际上是中国政府的替身。所谓替身是什么意思呢？就是说啊，就他的这一套理论跟中国政府的官方叙事应该说是一模一样。也就是说，不管他是不是中国政府的官员啊，但他讲述的是中国政府的逻辑，所以啊，他其实跟西方媒体记者中间的这种碰撞本身呢，有独特的价值。因为啊，中国和西方之间是一个割裂的社会，经常是中国自说自话，而西方呢一直希望能有一种双方碰撞也好啊，或者交流也好啊，但是双方基本是鸡同鸭讲，甚至和鸡和鸭都不见面。 那就没意思了啊。但是啊，如果中国的这套叙事逻辑啊，能够面对西方的这种媒体记者的这种挑战啊，那这本身实际上是非常有价值的。价值在哪儿呢？也就是说，可以让我们看到中国政府坚持的哪些价值观，事实上是有道理可讲的，而有哪些价值观实际上是根本站不住脚的。那这个呢，是高志凯这些人接受西方媒体过程中间的一个独特价值。说句心里话，在早些年的时候啊，这个是有中国的一些高级官员接受过西方媒体记者采访的。你就比如说当年的朱镕基，是吧？我们接受西方媒体记者采访的时候，在美国的时候，那有人记者问他，说你中国为什么要坚持统一台湾呢？那朱镕基反应就很快啊。
我刚才在克林顿总统的办公室看到了阿布拉罕·林肯总统的这个肖像。我想当年林肯总统为了保持美国的完整，反对这个独立和分离，不惜使用武力。我们应该向林肯总统学习。
那朱镕基那面对西方媒体记者采访过程中所表现出来的这种睿智啊，那也说明当年的这个中国的这些政府官员呢，确确实实还是非常不错的。你包括老姜跟华莱士谈笑风生啊。
You are the last major dictatorship, the last major communist dictatorship in the world.
You mean I'm dictatorship?
Well, of course. A developmental dictatorship is what we believe it is. Am I wrong?
Of course. This is big mistake.
Big mistake.
Of course.
This shows you don't know China that well.
Oh, I don't know China that well. I've been here half a dozen times.
我想要问你问题 What means dictatorship?
Dictatorship? When you do not have freedom of the press. And there is not freedom of the press here. There is not. You are. It seems to me. A dictator, an authoritarian.
No, but I very frank speaking, I don't agree with your point. I'm dictator.
I know you don't. I know that you don't. But
people,
there's an old American phrase about if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and so forth, it's a duck.
你这个是天方夜谭。
I think your way of describing what things are like here in China is as absurd as what the Arabian Nights may sound like. The reality in China is that we have leadership by the Communist Party. According to law, the party only makes recommendations. Everything needs to be approved by the National People's Congress.
也包括温家宝，我们过去做节目的时候，是吧？人家问他关于89年的评价，他当时还在那说。
我觉得我们国家
I believe that while moving ahead with the economic reforms, we also need to advance political reforms.
必须继续推进政治体制改革。
As our development is comprehensive in nature,
我们的发展应该是全面的发
our
展，
reform should also be
我们的
comprehensive.
改革也应该是全面的改革。
但是那个时代现在已经过去了，在过去的10-20年的时间里，中国的党和国家领导人基本上再也不会接受西方媒体的采访了。我们能看到的，无非就是高志凯这样的替身，在跟西方媒体的记者还有那么一点点火花，擦出一点火花。说句心里话，我们非常希望啊，那有一天我们中国的这些党和国家领导人还能够像当年那样接受西方媒体记者的采访。如果说中国强大了，那真正的自信应该是无惧这种所谓的挑衅式的提问。那其实啊，双方到底谁有道理的话，那观众就会看得一清二楚嘛。这是第二点。第三点就是说一说这个我作为一个同行对哈桑的评价啊。我觉得哈桑啊，整个在这一期节目中间啊，那现场的反应速度还是非常快的啊，确实也比较机智啊。但是我觉得有一点，就是哈桑啊，他给人感觉态度太嚣张，甚至还有一些傲慢。我个人觉得，一个好的节目主持人，也包括这种脱口秀的节目主持人啊，实际上最令人佩服的这样的一个品质，应该是机智，现场的机智，而不是说你态度上的居高临下的傲慢。 因为如果你要是傲慢的话，其实你就算表现出来现场那些临机反应能力啊，也会将你这个节目本身让人接受的那种度啊大大降低了。不管怎么说吧，那我还是希望啊这样的节目能够越多越好。你就比如说有一天，赵立坚也包括胡锡进这样的人，要是也能上哈桑这样的节目，如果不能上哈桑的节目，如果能接受我们王巨派的采访，那我觉得也会非常精彩，是不是？好，我们今天的节目就讲到这里啊，谢谢大家。
2,952 to 0.
Yes, that's exactly what I said.
Could you not find a few people just to make it look a little even? One or two?
Mehdi, it's not surprising. It's not surprising.
2,952 to 0.
What if he is the guy for all the Communist Party of China? Corruption is rampant.
How do we know they're corrupt? They just disappeared. Where's the trial?
Corruption of all kinds in China need to be dealt with.
So where's the trial?
Mercilessness.
So where's the trial? Where's the trial of the former foreign minister? We don't even know where he is.
Mehdi, those things you don't know doesn't mean doesn't happen.
Where is the trial for this man you're just accusing of corruption?
Qin Gang was my good friend for more than 20 years.
Where is he then?
He is involved in corruption.
Where is he?
Can you please demonstrate that free speech and tell us what are Xi Jinping's 2 worst mistakes in the past 5 years?
Great question.
If you can demonstrate to us that it's okay to criticize Xi Jinping, the Chinese government, and China, or even just say Xi Jinping kind of resembles Winnie the Pooh, would be good enough for me. Thank you.
Victor, do you want to take that question?
Well, thank you.
我想当年林肯总统为了保持美国的完整，反对这个独立和分离，不惜使用武力。我们应该向林肯总统学习。